I'm so pleased that you're able to be here, so many of you in person, and that others of you are able to join us by Zoom, and welcome you as well. I know it was an unusually challenging travel day to be here, and so grateful to all of you for being able to join us one way or the other for this special program. And I also want to acknowledge with gratitude the partnership of the ACLU in co-sponsoring this event, and to welcome the many officers and members of the National Board of the ACLU who are able to be here for this program today. It's a great honor to partner with you and to have you here. The occasion for our gathering is the celebration of a new book by our longstanding colleague, Professor Susan Herman. And by our, I of course mean both Brooklyn Law School and the ACLU, because she is a longtime and legendary leader for both of us here at Brooklyn Law School. Of course, she's been a member of our faculty for 23 years, a renowned and prolific scholar of constitutional law and criminal procedure, a beloved teacher and mentor to students and colleagues alike, and a respected leader within our faculty throughout her long time here. But also somehow, simultaneously, a longtime leader of the ACLU and the inaugural holder of the Ruth Bader Ginsburg Chair here at Brooklyn Law School, which is, of course, tremendously fitting, given that she follows in the footsteps of the Justice as both General Counsel and then President of the ACLU. With Professor Herman serving for more than a dozen years as president from 2008 to 2021. Professor Herman's new book, An Advanced Introduction to U.S. Civil Liberties, was published just a couple of months ago, and it's an ambitious and cogent analysis of the shifting landscape of civil rights in the United States, covering everything from the First Amendment and substantive due process to constitutional criminal procedure and beyond. And the topic of her book, and thus today's program, could of course not be more important nor more timely. As she observes in her book, the civil liberties protected by the Constitution have expanded and contracted through the years, not only because of constitutional amendments and changes in theories of constitutional interpretation, but also in response to external events. And today, of course, we meet at a time of unusual uncertainty about the future of the trajectory of civil rights in this country because of a confluence of seismic external events, increasing polarization in our politics that jeopardizes the foundation of our democratic process, changes to the composition of the Supreme Court that have, of course, overturned longstanding precedent and invited reconsideration of longstanding doctrine. And, of course, we meet at the end of a terrible and horrific week of violence that ushers in war in the Middle East and dramatic new anxieties throughout our country and around the world about the prospect of terror and the state of human rights. Attempting to forecast the future of civil liberties under such intense pressure as the developments that I've just outlined is, of course, a daunting task, even to forecast it over a few years, much less for the next century. But fortunately, we are joined today by a truly star-studded panel of experts to take on the challenge, including the legendary Dean Erwin Chemerinsky of Berkeley Law School, the acclaimed author Ellis Cose, Anthony Romero, Executive Director of the ACLU, and Nadine Strawson, John Marshall Harlan, Professor Emerita at New York Law School and former President of the ACLU. And before turning over the podium to Professor Herman to say more about the panel and to introduce the program, I want to acknowledge that she is a hero not only in her own work, her scholarship and teaching, but also in just being here today. because she has suffered a very untimely and rather serious injury to her hamstring, which makes her presence here today a miracle of her and a testament to her will. So with that, I will turn it over to Susan and get out of your way. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for saying that. Now I don't have to decide whether to out myself, but that's why I'm limping around. So if I lie down or leave or stand at any point, just, keep going. Don't be distracted or alarmed. So that was a lovely introduction. Thank you. And ordinarily I would say, I don't need to say anything. Let's just get to the panel. But today is actually about me. So I'm going to say a few words. And the first word I want to say is wow. Just looking at the faces of people, it just boggles my mind to see people from so many different parts of my lives. Yeah, I have my life, only one. So I wonder with students and former students and colleagues from the law school and from the ACLU and my best friend from high school and Paul Gangsey, my husband, not to mention these great people up here. And I'm just so sorry that I can't actually see the faces of all of you on Zoom, who are many beloved friends and family members. So, as some of you know, I trace my identity as a civil libertarian to the day in my third grade class where I learned for the first time that I was not allowed to take books out of my public school library if they had been placed in the boys section. Now, I knew about the girls section, and that contained collections of fairy tales and biographies of presidents' wives, but I had never known that I wasn't allowed to take books out of the boys section until I tried. So I thought this was interesting and somewhat disappointing. But when I told my mother about this, she wasn't just disappointed, she was furious. So she called up the school and she gave them a piece of her mind for telling her daughter what she should read, what she should dream, what she should be. And in only a matter of a few days, the policy changed. So the ACLU was founded in 1920 and works in 14 different areas of civil rights and civil liberties as we count them. And victories don't always come that easy. Don't you wish it only took a phone call, Anthony, to say, oh, could you play? Oh, well, yes, thank you. So that doesn't happen so often. So the other thing I think that one reason why I wanted to start with that story is that the ACLU has been around since 1920, and that's something that, my experience in third grade. But is there anything happening these days involving schools that are trying to tell kids what they can and can't read and what history they can and can't read? So the opening line in my book is a quote from the ACLU's first executive director, Roger Baldwin, who said, "The battle for civil liberties never stays won." And so that's a lot of what my book is about, is kind of the pendulum swings. And the book talks about how, starting in 1920, the Supreme Court began to recognize various civil liberties, starting with the First Amendment appropriately, and sort of growing a whole bunch of different civil liberties that would be protected by the courts. But there's always something new, and there are always recurrences of the same old problem. So when I stepped down from my role as ACLU president in January 2021, having served as president for almost precisely 2 terms of Barack Obama and 1 term of, need we mention his name, where there was a lot of exciting things going on at the ACLU. So Elgar, which is a UK publisher, invited me to write this book, which is part of a series that they have of advanced introduction to this, that, and the other thing. And I thought, well, that would be pretty good closure on my career as a civil liberties generalist. So I agreed to write the book. And talked about, the kind of rise of judicial enforcement. I didn't go that heavy on the ACLU's role, although I could have, and maybe Ellis will talk about, the ACLU's role as part of the discussion. And then, just also about bringing it up to date, our kind of recent discoveries, very painful discoveries, that a lot of the rights that we thought have won have not stayed won. They come, they go. So when my longtime friend and the law school's research dean of research and scholarship, Jocelyn Simonson, said, "Oh, well, you're publishing a book. We should have a book event." My response is, no, it's not that kind of book. It's only 150 pages. It's part of a series. I had, required format. And it's really more kind of informative, especially for people outside the United States, than it is transformative. So why would you have a book event about a book like this? So Jocelyn, knowing me, said, well, what if we also made it a celebration of your career at the ACLU? Well, that got me, because when you look at the book, you will see that the dedication of this book is to the people of the ACLU, of the board, the staff, the national, the affiliates. Now, I dedicated my last book to Paul, so he was actually okay with sharing. So anyway, that's what this book was all about. So then after we decided that maybe it would be appropriate to have this be about the ACLU as well as being about my book and about me, the wonderful Andrew Domingue, where did you go, Andrew? There he is. Okay, he's walking around as usual because he always has to do something to make things work. Right, there he is, making things work. So Andrew, with this full support of his boss, this guy over here in the blue suit, said, well, how about if the ACLU co-sponsors this event? You would be happy to collaborate and co-sponsor. So the reason that we are here on a Friday night, which is a tough night for people in a commuter school, right? It's an unusual night, and a lot of people could not be here for that reason. But the people who we could not do without were the ACLU board members who are meeting in Manhattan tomorrow and Sunday. So the people who were able to travel early enough today to be here are here. So at the reception, look for all those name tags, and you will meet civil libertarians from all over the country, including, is Jeff here, Hawaii, Alaska, just from, there's Rick from Hawaii. And so anyway, that's why we're doing this. So I think that in addition to having all the board members here, as well as the ACLU senior staff, which is pretty amazing, there are all sorts of interesting people you can meet at the reception. But I thought that given that this was the audience, that I was not really that interested in having something that was a Festschrift, that great academic word, where everybody would just have to talk about how great I am. And I wasn't that interested in having people just talk about how great the book is, because it seemed to me that this book is a platform. So what I invited my friends here, these rock stars, to talk about is to kind of use the book as a springboard or as a kind of prologue, thinking about the history of U.S. civil liberties, how they developed, how they've ended up where they are today. What can we learn to help us get the pendulum swinging back in the other direction? So the speakers are going to proceed in traditional alphabetical order because Nadine Allen Toy isn't here, so we don't have to do it his way. And you have quite interesting and lengthy biographies of them that are linked in the invitation, so I don't need to spend the time that it would take to properly introduce each and every one of these really remarkable people. But as Jean Meyer said, Erwin Chemerinsky, and that is how you say it, right, is the dean at UC Berkeley Law School currently. He's been the dean of other law schools. He's the immediate past president of the American Association of Law Schools. And one of the things that I learned decades ago about Erwin when we used to fly around the country speaking this place and that place is that among his many superpowers, he doesn't get jet lag. Is that still true? So I felt less guilty about inviting him to cross the country. He flew in last night and he's flying back tonight. So here he is. So after Erwin, we will be hearing from Ellis Coase. Ellis is not a lawyer, the only one on the panel. He's a journalist, and he is both an author and an independent radio producer. He was the first writer in residence at the ACLU, and he is the one who wrote the book about the ACLU. He wrote a history of the ACLU for the ACLU's 100th anniversary in 2020, which is called Democracy If We Can Keep It, and a bunch of other important books, so he brings a great perspective. Next, the man in the blue suit, Anthony Romero is the 6th executive director of the ACLU. If you start doing the math, you'll see how long a tenure many ACLU leaders tend to have, only the 6th since 1920. So one thing I will tell you about Anthony is he got a real baptism by fire. He started the job during the week before 9/11, leading an organization whose headquarters are on Broad Street in Lower Manhattan. So since then, he has proceeded under the 4 different presidents, 4 very different kinds of presidents, to not only keep the organization steady, but to grow the organization in many different ways, and still have time to write a couple of books himself and to visit every single ACLU affiliate, 51 at this point, okay, all around the country, and also Puerto Rico, of course. Last but not least, my predecessor, Nadine Strawson, was the 6th president of the ACLU, so you can see I was the 7th, so again, pretty long tenures. Nadine, unbelievably, served in that role for 18 years. And while she was doing that, she flew around the world probably 8,000 times in her speaking engagements. Somebody said at one point that there was no computer powerful enough to log her frequent flyer miles. I only recently learned yesterday that she says she has no sense of direction, which I find actually remarkable given all that. So at the same time, Nadine has also written several very important books on topics like pornography and hate speech, while also teaching at New York Law School and going all over the place. So without further ado, I want to invite Erwin to start us off. I had suggested various themes that the speakers could address, general themes, but I also told them that at the end that they could also just say whatever they want, because board members who knew me as president of the board, I always thought it was rather ironic that one of my chief jobs at the front of the room of the ACLU board was to repress speech. Okay, but not tonight. I'm not repressing any of you. So, Erwin, take it away.
Thank you. It's such an honor and pleasure to be here and wonderful to celebrate Susan in this terrific book. As she mentioned, she and I spoke together at so many conferences for judges and lawyers all over the country. We worked together on an enormous number of things over the years, and I just admire her tremendously as a teacher, as a scholar, as an activist, and I really like this book, so you should get it. It's a terrific summary of civil liberties. As with everything Susan does, it's beautifully written, it's very clear, and it just provides so much information in a relatively small number of pages. We were asked to offer thoughts about the future of civil liberties and civil rights, and I would offer 4 comments in that regard. First, the things that Susan and everyone on this panel has been fighting for, related to civil liberties and civil rights, are as important or more important than ever. Think about the things that Susan's fought for, whether in the ACLU or through her scholarship or other projects. Racial equality. Racial injustice in our society is as great as they've ever been, at least in recent years. There doesn't seem to be any lessening of the gaps between whites and racial minorities with regard to income or wealth. Issues with regard to affirmative action are worse now than they've been in 45 years. Think about it with regard to sexual orientation and gender identity, the threat that occurs to gay, lesbian, and transgender individuals right now in so many parts of the country. The continuing need to fight for sex equality, the fact that still the Equal Rights Amendment hasn't been adopted. Voting rights, the threat to voting rights that exist in laws that have been adopted in so many states. We can go on and talk about the rights of criminal defendants, which Susan has been teaching and writing about for so long. We can talk about prisoners and the failure to provide protection for their rights. We can talk about how the Supreme Court has obliterated the Establishment Clause and any notion of a separation of church and state. We can talk about the threats to free speech and the unique challenges because of the internet. And so I think if there's anything that should come from this discussion, it's the need for all of us to recommit to fighting for the things, Susan, that these panelists have been fighting for years. The second observation is that the protection, the advancement of civil rights and civil liberties is not going to come from the United States Supreme Court for the foreseeable future. 25 years ago, I wrote the first edition of a constitutional law casebook. Last month, I finished the 7th edition. I have never done an edition where so much changed in a short period of time. In fact, I can't think of an edition I've done that changed so much from the very first edition. Think about just the last 2 years from the Supreme Court. The court's overruled Roe versus Wade. The court's dramatically expanded gun rights. The court for the first time has said that a public school teacher has a First Amendment right to pray at public school events. The court's held that when the government gives aid to secular private schools, it is constitutionally required to give it to religious schools. The court's imposed significant new limits on administrative agencies. The Supreme Court has effectively overruled 45 years of precedent that allowed college universities to engage in affirmative action. The Supreme Court for the first time has said that a business establishment has the right to discriminate in violation of state law when it's engaged in expressive activity. The reality is this is the court we're going to have for some time to come. Think of the age of the conservative justices. Clarence Thomas is 75 years old. Samuel Alito is 73. John Roberts is 68. The 3 Trump appointees, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, are still in their 50s. I've long thought that the best predictor of a long lifespan is someone to be confirmed to the United States Supreme Court. John Paul Stevens didn't retire until he was 90. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was still in the court when she died at age 87. I can put it in very stark terms. Amy Coney Barrett was 48 when she was confirmed for the court. She remains on the court until she's 87. She'll be a justice to the year 2059. So the reality is we're not going to be able to look to this Supreme Court to advance equality and freedom in the areas that I quickly went through a moment ago. My third comment is then we have to look to other paths to advance equality and freedom. Occasionally, there will be victories in the United States Supreme Court. There was some last year with regard to voting rights. But in all of the areas that I mentioned, it was 6-3 decisions to rule against advancing equality, to roll back civil rights. But there are other forums to look to advance civil rights and civil liberties. There's state courts and state constitutions. States, under their constitutions, can provide more protection of rights than the U.S. Constitution. It was in 1977 that William Brennan wrote an article in the Harvard Law Review urging states to use state constitutions to advance individual liberties. He saw how much more conservative the court had become in light of the Nixon appointees. And of course, the court today is so much more conservative than it was in 1977. There are areas where the Supreme Court's decisions don't allow state courts to do more. Where the Supreme Court finds a Second Amendment right, states can't provide less protection than that. Where the Supreme Court eliminates affirmative action, states can't do more than that. But the Supreme Court is leaving a great deal to the political process. The obvious examples with regard to reproductive freedom. And there have been decisions, including in some conservative states, like North Dakota, South Carolina, where courts have provided protection for reproductive freedom more than the United States Constitution. There can be protection of rights through state legislatures. We've seen this happen in states with regard to limits on policing. Though the United States Supreme Court has refused to change the doctrines of qualified immunity, the Colorado legislature adopted a law limiting qualified immunity for suits against police officers. The Nevada Supreme Court eliminated qualified immunity under Nevada law for suits against police officers in state court. We've seen in some states, including red states like Kansas, voters adopting initiatives to protect reproductive freedom. Or we saw recently in Ohio the rejection of a change in the procedure, which have endangered the ability to protect reproductive freedom at the ballot box. There can even be changes at the local level. Some cities, after the tragic death of George Floyd, finally outlawed the chokehold for the use by their police forces, something that should have been done long time ago. So I think what's crucial for those, and I'm sure it's all of us, who want to see advances of freedom and equality, is to look for the paths that we can succeed in, whether it's in state courts, under state constitutions, state legislatures, local governments, and we need to use those. It's harder because it has to be fought state by state. It's not going to be just one decision by the United States Supreme Court, but it is possible, and that's what we need to do. Fourth and finally, there's the question that Susan posed for us, and where do we get hope for the future? She gave us some questions to talk about, and that was one of them. And that's what I wanted to conclude for. I've thought a lot about this in talking to my students. I've been a law professor for 44 years, and I've never seen some of my students as discouraged as they are now about the Constitution and the Supreme Court. And what I tell them is I think the hope has to come from the sweep of history. That when you think about equality and freedom, overall there's been such advances over time. History has looked well on the arguments that progressives have made in the past in this area. I mean, with regard to race, there are terrible racial inequalities in our society. There's a need for urgent action now as there's been ever since the country began. But think to what the Constitution did with regard to race in 1787. Or think of the apartheid that segregated southern states and some border states. I was born in 1953. Every southern state and many border states had Jim Crow laws that segregated every aspect of life. The Civil Rights Act, advances in state law, there's certainly been protections. I mean, think with regard to sex. Women didn't have the right to vote until 1920. Think about just the difference in the composition of law schools or sexual orientation. It wasn't until 8 years ago that finally gays and lesbians were accorded equal dignity and the right to marry. So I tell my students that the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. got it exactly right when he said the arc of the moral universe is long and bends towards history. And my message to them is that'll only happen if they fight for it. And so when Susan asked us, what is it that gives us hope for the future? Some of it is looking to the past, and some of it is my students. I see how idealistic they are. I see how committed they are to using the law to advance freedom and equality. And it really does give me hope for the future. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to start off by doing what I think Susan told us not to do, which is to congratulate her on a very magnificent book. And the great thing about her book, well, one of the great things about her book is that it's relatively short. I think it's about 150 pages. Yeah, and so you can basically one sitting, get a really in-depth understanding of our trajectory on civil liberties and civil rights. And also a perspective that's influenced by, obviously, her time at the ACLU. When I think of civil liberties, I also think of civil rights. They sort of come in similar baskets. And my sort of, not exactly precise, but way of sort of distinguishing between them is that I tend to think of civil liberties as those rules, those things that protect us from the government. And I tend to think of civil rights as those things that protect us from each other. But however you categorize them, however you think of them, as Erwin has made clear and as Susan sort of alluded to, they're rather fragile. And we have a sense, we have a way of thinking that these things have been with us so long, that nothing can sort of dislodge them. And that's not quite true. I mean, what a lot of people tend to forget, and since Susan sort of invited me to play historian for a second, I'll do that for a bit. But what people often forget, because they tend to think of the Bill of Rights as having been ratified basically 2.5 years after the Constitution. So it's been with us for a very long time. And that's true. But it hasn't been respected for most of that time. And it's interesting, you only have to go to 1798 with the Alien and Sedition Acts, when Congress basically threw the Bill of Rights out the door. And for a long time, it sort of stayed there. And the reason that, one of many reasons actually, that the ACLU is so important is that it breathed new life into that document. We often forget that prior to the 1900s, actually prior to 1925, the Bill of Rights didn't even apply to the states. We tend to think that it was something permanent, and so let me just retrace a little bit of that history, because Susan correctly pointed out, the ACLU was formed in 1920, but the ACLU did not begin as the ACLU. It began as something called the American Union Against Militarism. Basically a peace group. And it was formed at a time when there was a huge movement nationwide to keep the United States out of World War I. And Crystal Eastman and her progressive colleagues got together in 1915 and said, let's form something to fight this mood of militarism in this country and to keep us from getting into that war. By 1917, that became moot, of course, because we did get into the war. And that was, what was not yet the ACLU formed something called the National Civil Liberties Bureau. And the National Civil Liberties Bureau, again, was not really a civil liberties organization the way that we tend to think of the broad civil liberties organization. It was fundamentally an organization whose mission was to help young men who were conscientious objectors. And it spent a lot of energy and time doing that. Between 1917 and 1920, when it was formed, we had 1919. What happened in 1919? Well, pretty much everything. You had this war against labor. You had violence going on all over the place. You had a war against African Americans. You had huge race riots going on all over the place. Partly, because, and this was right after World War I, of course. Partly because the country, or certain people in the country, didn't want black folks to sort of get it into their heads, so they had rights. Now that some of them had participated in World War One. You had the Palmer raids, because there was all this fear of socialism and communists that taking place all over the country, tens of thousands of people being sort of rounded up. And the core folks who made up the ACLU were very much involved in sort of resisting this, protesting it, talking against it, getting involved with the IWW and other organizations that were directly affected by this. And so by the time 1920 rolled around, and the discussion became one, of what they should do, it made perfect sense for the ACLU to form. But again, it evolved. It was not an organization that began immediately filing lawsuits and going to the Supreme Court. It was an organization that one popularized the idea with sort of community theater and things of that nature to try to spread awareness about free speech and about other civil liberties. And if you want to sort of pick a date when civil liberties in the modern sense began to be born, I think you might as well go to 1925 when you had the Gitlow decision, which was basically a fellow who had published some kind of socialist manifesto and was brought up on charges, state charges in New York, and ended up being actually convicted. But there were two and the ACLU was very directly involved in that case, and there were two. There was a very powerful dissent. It was really not a dissent. It was a concurrence, but it was a very powerful argument that was made by Holmes and by Brandeis. Basically, which did a couple of things. I mean, it basically articulated a rationale for protecting free speech, but it also incorporated the Bill of Rights in a way that made the the Equal Protection Clause applied the Bill of Rights to states. And that gave the ACLU a tool to go after criminal syndicate laws and various other things that had not really been that easy to contend with before that. The point being that part of why I think these things are so fragile is not only because we get very nervous as a country when our sense of safety and security is threatened, and we decide maybe these things are not so important, but also because the tradition of protection for the civil liberties, of protection of civil rights, is not nearly as long-lasting, as deep, or as broad as we often like to think that it is. And for that reason, these things, we need to get reminders every now and again of what they mean, why they're important, and why they are essential to the society that we have today. And we're in a moment, as the previous speakers have already made clear, where again, a number of rights are coming into question. We're in a moment where a number of people are feeling very insecure, not just in the United States, but across the world. And of course, we have two big wars as already, and who knows where that's going to end up. But we also have experienced Trumpism. And part of why we experience Trumpism is that there continues to be a tremendous appetite for promoting divisiveness and promoting nostalgia about an America that never existed. And it's hardly coincidental, to my way of thinking, that Trumpism arose around the same time, and not too long after, the Census Bureau projected that come some point in the future, the actual point they projected was 2045, as I recall, but that come some point in the future, the United States is going to become a majority-minority nation. I personally think that projection is nonsense for all kinds of reasons. I think part of the reason it's nonsense is because we have a history in this country of redefining race. And that's based on an assumption that we're going to think about race the same way in 2045 that we do now. I don't think that's true. It's also based on a set of assumptions that the racial groups will act the same in 2045 as they do now. I don't think that's necessarily true either. But I think that the very idea was powerful enough to scare the bejesus out of a lot of people and to make it possible for one political party to go absolutely nuts as it tries to take us back to some imagined past, I guess in the 1940s or somewhere back there, where all of these bothersome people of color and other kinds of minorities were not much of a factor. And the bad news is I don't think this period's going to end anytime soon. I think we're looking at something very generational. And as Erwin pointed out, I mean, the Supreme Court's not going to go away anytime soon. It's going to be around for a while. But the other thing that's not exactly generational is that the founders never expected this Constitution to last as long as it is, as it has. And it's really showing its age. And I'll in a couple of seconds, but when the Constitution was enacted, the largest state in the nation was Virginia. The smallest state was Delaware. What was the difference in their size? 8-1, 12-1 if you included enslaved persons. What's the largest state now? California. The smallest one, Wyoming. What's the difference in their size? 67 times. And yet they have the same power in the Senate, the same number of votes in the Senate. We have a sort of minority bias in that sense built into the Constitution. And we have an Article 5 problem if you try to get rid of it. By the same token, obviously the Electoral College is a relic. But it's not going to be something that we can easily get rid of. The last time we amended the Constitution meaningfully was close to 50 years ago when we gave young people the vote. We did it also about 30 years ago, but that was just to deal with congressional salaries. We have a Constitution, despite the intention of making it easy to change, is extremely difficult to change. And at some point, it's going to have to. How that's going to happen, I don't know. But just to end, I mean, I think what we're looking at is a war that's going to go on for a generation as we fight for the future of this country. And the one thing that gives me some hope about this is that the generation coming behind us has a very different way of looking at things than the current generation. How that's going to play out, I really don't know. But I think the way they have looking at things is not at all, does not bode well at all for the current crazy Republican Party. And I think I'll end it there.
So I want to maybe pick up where Alice left off, but before I do, I want to make sure I break the rules and do thank Susan Herman, for this book and for the invitation and for everything she's done in my career and my life. She was on the search committee that hired me, chaired by my other boss, Nadine Strawson, who invited me to this remarkable adventure of running this sometimes unwieldy organization in some of the most challenging of times, and it's been a thrill of a lifetime. And to be on a panel with Irwin, to have known Ellis for almost 30 years now, and when I tried to convince him to come and be our first writer in residence and say, you need to write an accessible book about the history of the ACLU. We have many great books. No offense, boss, right? We have many great books. Sam Walker's book is very thorough, and I've read them all. But we needed something that I could hand to my nephew and read it. It's a narrative, and Ellis Coase did precisely that. I think I disagree with some of your depictions of my leadership, but that's okay. It's really an exceptional piece, and so it's just really humbling to be here among this group of individuals. And thank you, Susan, for this most recent contribution. It's a wonderful. We're buying it for every new ACLU staff member. That you have to read this before you show up. 150 pages. It's part of the beginning. Let me, as a person who's not an academic and don't pretend to have the intellect of the individuals up here with me or our host, I want to reflect a little bit about perspective of someone as a practitioner and how I see the work playing out from where I am in the foxhole, in the cockpit, as whatever metaphor you like to use. And I think about when they ask me what are the challenges to our democracy, partly just because of ease of reference, I try to bucket them into two buckets of the challenges to our democracy. And one is to think about the challenges to our norms and rules and procedures and the functioning of our institutions. And you can think about all the different ways in which democracy is challenged that way, with the denial of individuals' right to vote, like the cases in Georgia and elsewhere, efforts to circumvent or subvert elections, like these vote-denying secretaries of state, the impeaching of officials with whom we disagree, like we see in Wisconsin, an effort to really kind of gut the workings, the machinery of democracy. And those occupy a great deal of our time, our thought, our concern. And then the second bucket, which is the efforts to gut the rights and liberties that define a democracy, that make a democracy worth living in, right? That's why you believe in small d democracy, is the rights to be who you are and to associate freely and to speak your mind and to love who you wish and worship any God or no God at all. And every way in which we decide what this gift of human life looks like when you want to live with human dignity. Our struggle is ultimately about the right to live with dignity, the way you define it. And so it works for me because it keeps the 14 issue areas I can't begin to wrap my mind around. But two, I can do that pretty well. And so, and when I think about the decline of American democracy, I see them on both fronts. And I think the through line has been, it's been a faint and often faint-hearted and incomplete commitment to those principles. But I think this through line of the challenges to these to democratic norms, institutions, and to the rights that animate a democracy, I see it also as taking a supercharged role with the war on terror. And maybe that's because that's the time in which I began my work at the organization, but also because it's a lot of what the rights lost at that time, what seemed to be abstractions became real realities in terms of how we treated people, and whether that was the injustice and inhumane treatment of prisoners in our custody who were waterboarded and tortured, the great work of Jamil Jaffer, who's in the room, to uncover that for this country. To the very same attacks we see now against trans people, right, to dehumanize and deny them the care or the dignity they deserve. So that's how I think about the challenges we confront. That was one of the questions that Susan put to us. She asked also then, how do we respond in this new environment? So from my perspective, I take another cue from another one of the great minds I have surrounding me, is the work of David Cole in his book, Engines of Liberty, and the importance of engaging around narratives in publics. That ultimately, it's about changing hearts and minds, and the impact of that on changing laws, institutions, legislatures. And I think that work has never become more important in some of the issues that we've been trying to move the needle on for these so many decades of our existence. I think we need to double down on thinking about the Overton window, something else that Deidre Schiffling, who's our national political director, talks to me about. And I think we are challenged in places like criminal justice reform. I think we missed the ball on some of the ways in which we were characterizing the struggle for criminal justice reform. I was one of the people who called for defunding the police. Be clear, you'll find it on the line. There's a TED Talk. I think that was a mistake. Not because I was wrong about the solution, because I think ultimately the cops and the police had too much money and very little accountability, and that government officials, including state and local government officials, were not willing to exercise oversight on police. But I think I fundamentally missed the boat on the narrative around the defund frame. And it was too easy for our opponents then to capture the flag and say that you are not standing up for the safety and security of often the very same communities and people who are subjected to the over-policing and over-incarceration, the places where I kind of grew up in the South Bronx. That was the issue that my mom and dad most worried about, was the crime and the gangs and the drugs and the violence. And when you have and I try to think about it every once in a while, I remember, what would my mother say to a kind of a refrain that talked about defunding the police? She would say, Antonio, estás loco. You're crazy, right? Because you miss the opportunity of talking about the importance of safety and security to the very same communities that are subjected to that at the same time that you're talking about reforming institutions which are entrenched. And so I think we need to change some of the way we think about that narrative. I think about the contribution around immigrants. What's changed in this country, right? I mean, I feel whipsawed often in this job. I started on 9/11. I saw the attack and the corralling of Muslims and Arabs and Asians, John Ashcroft counting the numbers of people on TV about who he rounded up, police going after taxi cab drivers and people selling in the kind of food stands, and the security guard at my own institution being summarily deported to Pakistan, and everyone was kind of on that bandwagon, including NPR reporters that I had arguments with, and I was like, holy, this is crazy. The idea that there's Islamophobia, anti-Muslim sentiment that gripped the country in the early days of 9/11, to fast forward when Donald Trump becomes president, and the week after he signs into the executive order, the Muslim ban, people are rushing to the airports, right? Holding up signs saying, we are all Muslims. We are all immigrants. And then you fast forward to today, 5 years later, and you have this mayor of ours talking about too many immigrants at the Roosevelt Hotel. And the whipsawing around how immigrants are venerated and protected and then demonized and venerated and protected. And that's good. You can trace it back to the Palmer raids and you can see a through line. And we need to do a better job of keeping the narrative about what that contribution actually means and who they are and why we are engaged with them. And I think we lost a little bit of that sight. Otherwise, we wouldn't be struggling with liberals who are now faint-hearted about what's going on at the border. And I think it makes the point that we need to double down on that narrative. Another example around transgender rights. I'm incredibly proud of the work my organization does to defend the rights of transgender people, individuals, and communities. We have almost half the cases on transgender rights are carried by ACLU lawyers across this country. Half of them that are in court. 500 some odd anti-trans bills have been dropped in state legislatures. And I think we've been winning the vast majority of them. So far, it feels like running the gauntlet. I worry, though, that we haven't, and we're now beginning to pay closer attention, and our wonderful colleagues like Chase Strangio, who does this work for us, he and I have been thinking through how do we get to the parts of the publics that are not with us? You know, how do we convince people that this is a human rights struggle that affects all of us and not just a small minority of individuals that people don't fully understand? And the importance of getting parents to speak out about the struggles of their transgender children, like we did on trial in Arkansas. Really important to lay the groundwork for that narrative change. Or to be able to tap the Republican family members of transgender people, and they exist, and they're out there, and we're pulling them out. They need to speak out on behalf of the rights and liberties of their own family members, and a way to change the narrative around that so that we can bring the public debate around it. The freedom of speech issue, which I know Nadine will cover, so important to engage in the narrative around it. Charlottesville was a very controversial flashpoint for my organization. There were many who were not sure we should have represented Stephen Kessler and the Nazis in Charlottesville. Some of that, I think, has begun to change because people have begun to see what, if you don't commit to the freedom of expression for all people, there'll be an effort to shut down the rights and liberties and the freedom of speech for individuals who don't have power. And the attacks, I think, on critical race theory and the attacks on black history, on the Stop Woke, the attacks on Palestinian activists, I think make the point of why defending freedom of speech is so essential to the functioning of our democracy. As messy as it becomes, it undergirds the workings of our democratic institutions and our rights and liberties. So I think the narrative work we're engaged in or endeavoring to do more explicitly is probably the most important. Second pivot, and I have three, so this will be quicker now. The pivot to political work. Now, the ACLU, as Ellis will tell you, as one of our historians, was founded as an activist group, right? The National Civil Liberties Bureau was changed ultimately to the American Civil Liberties Union because they wanted to claim the union of the growing labor movement, right? It was, the idea of card-carrying members was also to try to assemble themselves more alongside of unions rather than bureaus. And for 50 years, all we had was a political arm. The largest line in our budget that was adopted in 1921, I think was $20,000 for propaganda. That was what they called it. And they saw their job as being a political movement, as deploying people. They were not lawyers. They were not tax-exempt organizations. The tax-exempt foundation, the ACLU Foundation, would come almost 40, 50 years later under R.A. Nyer. But for all those years of our existence, our work was exclusively as a political 501c4, a charitable organization with a political kind of agenda. And in some ways, I think the great work that we did as lawyers, as litigators, for all those years, people began to think it was only about litigation. It was only about being a law firm. It was only about being a legal group. And in many respects, I think the work we're doing today is bringing us back to our roots. When the courts don't provide us an opportunity to make the advances we want, then we will have to necessarily use the political arena. And we should be unapologetic about it and unafraid about it. We're not the American Bar Association. They may pretend to be non-political. This agenda of ours to defend the rights and liberties of all people is inherently a political agenda. We can do it in a nonpartisan way. We can criticize Republicans and we can criticize Democrats. We can work with them both. But I think to not engage in the political realm would be malpractice for a social justice practitioner like me. And I've been thrilled to see that the work we've done in the political realm has been really highly effective. I mean, Erwin touched on this. We're ready in the last several years since the Dobbs decision. We've run 5 ballot referenda in states across this country to advance and defend abortion rights. We've won every single one of them. Even in states where you have to convince a majority of Republicans to join you. In Kansas, it was not a bunch of liberals or latte-sipping, Bruno Magli-wearing liberals who voted there. It was good old Republicans in Kansas that we were able to kind of bring along and say, no, you got to vote down this anti-abortion initiative. In Ohio, we're working our asses off to make sure that we convince moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats that this protection of abortion rights is critical. I think we run the gauntlet on this one. I think the Republican Party has so overreached on abortion rights that they've made our jobs a lot easier. And I think we ought to harvest that work without any fear of criticism or ultimately it's about, do we advance the protection for rights and liberties? And by any means necessary, that's lawful, let's do it. And I think the political realm is one that's really a critical part of it. Finally, the third pivot, I will say, as much as I love David Cole and his colleagues, and they play an awesome game of federal Supreme Court litigation, federal court and Supreme Court litigation, we're super smart, which theories we bring, which cases we bring, which clients we pick, where do you run the gauntlet, when do you settle, how do you split the circuits, what do you do now, what do you do 3 or 5 or 7 or 10 years? It's wonderful. They play an awesome game of master chess. But let's do that also in state Supreme Courts. And let's think about how we play that game of chess as thoughtfully, as strategically, as aggressively, as long-term in front of all these state Supreme Courts. The Supreme Court is a wonderful big institution that apparently the marbles are falling off of it. I just read that in the New York Times there was did you read that too? There was a piece of marble that fell off from one of the courtyards recently. Did you see that, Erwin?
How symbolic.
Yeah, I know. They lost their marbles, literally. But I think, they only take, 80 some odd cases a year? There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of possibilities more to bring state Supreme Court litigation. And the ACLU has this unique ability to do so because we have an office in every state. We have litigators in every state. And for a little bit more energy and a little bit more work, we can really get a lot more juice out of that squeeze if we begin to think about state Supreme Court litigation with the same level of acumen and discipline and analysis that we've done to the federal and the Supreme Court litigation. And already in just a very short period of time, I think that work has really borne fruit in places like Massachusetts and Nevada on criminal justice issues, in Nebraska and Utah on abortion. And so let's run the tables on state Supreme Courts. And if we're able to do that work there, then maybe we can obviate the importance of the Supreme Court, and Amy Coney Barrett can grow old and increasingly irrelevant at the Supreme Court level. I'll close by finally saying, Susan says, what gives you hope? And our optimism was one of her questions. And I think it's not something that something gives you hope or optimism. I mean, hope and optimism is a muscle you flex. And it kind of reinforces itself with you. I think the cynicism and the fatalism and the sadness that I sometimes see among young people, I'm just like, okay, we got to reboot that. Just turn that off and turn it back on and think in a more positive way. And then you will find that gives you more hope and optimism. The successes we have won in these 5 states on abortion rights give me hope. What we're doing in Ohio give me hope and optimism. And the more hope I channel, the more hope I feel. And so I don't really work out in any other way, but that's the one muscle I do flex is my hope and optimism muscle. And so far, so good. So thank you very much for listening.
Just to pick up on Anthony's last comment, when I saw David Cole in the audience, I was reminded of the fact that for many years I have had as the quote under my email signature, which nobody ever reads, including me. You don't get that far down. But it's something that David said, I believe, in a New York Times interview, and he in turn was quoting 2 other people, or paraphrasing 2 other people, Cornel West and Roberto Unger. And it was exactly the idea that you conveyed, Anthony, which rings so true to me. And the way David slash the people he was quoting put it was, hope is more the consequence of activism than its cause. And there's absolutely no doubt about it. But I also think of another saying, which also refers back to points that have been made by, I think in particular, by Irwin and by Ellis. And that is that whoever is not an optimist is not a realist, because you don't even have to go back as far in time as Irwin and Ellis did. Well, to some young people in the audience, it might seem like ancient history, but in my lifetime, in my adult lifetime, indeed, dare I say, even in the last couple of decades, I would say, if you look at the full scope of civil liberties, civil rights, human rights on the whole, yes, there have been very distressing setbacks, but I think the net movement is definitely toward the positive. And I also am extremely hopeful because of the renewed activism on the part of young people. I will never take that for granted. Unfortunately, the activism springs from tragedy. In this case, I think we can trace the resurgence of campus activism to the killing of Michael Brown in Missouri, which led to campus protests and demonstrations for racial justice that spread around the country. Obviously, the murder of George Floyd spurred unprecedented waves of activism. And that's the silver lining of the cloud of these tragedies. And it's not as if these catastrophes have not happened before. I think of when I became ACLU president in 1991, the videotaped beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles. And I know Irwin was living in LA and very involved in the police issues there. And Daryl Gates, then the police chief, boasting about chokeholds and how black people, it was their fault, right? There was something wrong with their windpipe. That's why they died. And it was so unprecedented. Young people here can't even relate to it. It was so unprecedented to capture visually in film this beating when the ACLU had been crusading forever against police abuse and unjustified force, especially against young men of color. And it's one thing to say it in words, but it was another thing to have that captured on videotape. Sadly, we did not make the progress that we hoped to make through that image, but with the spread of viral social media, again, people love to look at the focus at the adverse impact of social media, but let's look at the positive. These movements that had not gotten traction before, including Black Lives Matter, including Me Too, including many non-traditional political candidacies, are really taking advantage of the new. On the topic that I've mostly been dedicating myself to for the last half dozen or so years, freedom of speech, as Anthony alluded to, it's very common for people to badmouth young people, college students. Surveys are concerning that they don't show the same allegiance to some of the core free speech principles that Anthony alluded to, that if you want to have freedom for the speech that you love, you must defend freedom for the speech that you loathe. And yet the positive side of this is that where is the skepticism about free speech coming from? It's coming, and I think Ellis alluded to this rather somewhat cryptically, and maybe I'm reading too much into what you said, but when you talked about the younger generation being different, I don't take for granted how profoundly committed they are to equality and to racial justice and to justice for gender identity and sexual orientation minorities. In my lifetime, when I started college, there was a lot of hostility to civil rights. I mean, if you look at public opinion polls of public attitudes toward Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, when he died, he was an incredibly divisive, controversial, unpopular person who was being banned from speaking on campuses in the South. So not only the fact that we have a generation of students who are so committed to diversity, equality, inclusion, belonging, dignity. I love your summary of human rights, Anthony, the right to live life with dignity. I think that's something that seems to be profoundly shared and being committed to by today's young students. And, we had decades between the campus activism when I was a student in the 60s and 70s. We had several decades when public opinion polls showed that students were so indifferent to public issues. They didn't even pay attention to the news, let alone become engaged themselves. So we have a generation that is hungering for activism, committed to human rights, committed to dignity and equality, exercising their free speech rights with great vigor. And as we have all said, as a result of that activism, they will generate more optimism, and it becomes a virtuous circle, especially when they see the great results that Anthony was able to describe. So that was all a riff on what Anthony and my other distinguished co-panelists said. I wanted to start by joining everybody in thanking especially the person whose book we are celebrating, and we're not letting her censor us about it. I am so in awe of how much Susan is able to pack so effectively into such a short and readable book. There's an old saying among lawyers, if I had more time, I would make it shorter. Susan, I don't know, did you spend a decade making it so short? It's so readable, it's so interesting. And even though I know a fair amount about the subject myself, I learned so many new things, and I would like to give you a couple examples. I learned new facts that I'll admit I had not known. Maybe I should have known. I also got new insights that probably decades of teaching constitutional law I should have had, but I'm really indebted to Susan. So on the facts, I was thinking of one of them that was really startling to me when Ellis talked about civil rights or civil liberties essentially coming into being in some meaningful way in 1925. And I certainly understand that the theory behind that, the importance of the Gitlow decision, incorporating the Bill of Rights, making it enforceable against the states when the vast majority of violations of civil liberties were occurring at the state and local level. But Susan, I had not known about that 1923 decision that you talked about, Moore versus Dempsey. I had not known that. Susan's looking at me puzzled. How could I be so ignorant? Okay. And Ellis, you've written so much about these topics. I honestly did not know about the Elaine, Arkansas race massacre, and I think if I'm ignorant, there are probably a lot of other people who will learn those really important facts, and that the Supreme Court did something about it and in an era when it was not doing anything to protect any human rights. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, I think of as, excellent dissenter on free speech cases, but that he would be a pioneer and a trailblazer on racial justice and criminal justice, that was really interesting and inspiring. In terms of new insights, Susan talks about she talks about two cases in the same breath that I hadn't really thought about together. One was an fairly early case in which the Supreme Court upheld freedom to marriage for prisoners. Well, first of all, factually, I had not known that a prisoner was marrying another prisoner, so that was kind of an interesting fact that I hadn't gleaned before. And then Susan couples it with another decision in the same span of time in which the Supreme Court completely denied rights of prisoners to correspond with each other. So, as she points out, a prisoner had a right to marry another prisoner, but not to correspond with her. And I found that, just so interesting, especially in terms of the freedom of speech issues on which I've been focusing. Now, I do want to say something about that, but I want to put the free speech issues, I've already put them in a larger context to some extent by talking about campus skepticism about free speech coming from a positive motive. I mean, I really want to start with the positive. Second, I think Ellis really educated me several books ago. He's so prolific. He's probably written about 3 since then. But the book that you wrote, Ellis, about the structural problems that you talked about here, the gerrymandering in the Electoral College, and basically the disenfranchisement of so many people. I was invited by Ron Collins, who's a First Amendment maven and publishes something called the First Amendment News. He invited me to conduct an interview of Ellis about that book for a free speech series. And the book doesn't expressly address free speech. So at first I was a little bit puzzled, but I became so grateful because it really underscored for me, and this is a theme that Susan asked us to address, the integral interconnection among not only equality and racial justice and gender justice and free speech, as I've already alluded to, but the structural civil liberties and democracy issues as well. Because freedom of speech under the First Amendment is necessary but not sufficient to have meaningful freedom of speech in the robust sense that Anthony talks about freedom, which is a concept of individual dignity and, again, belonging, inclusivity. One of my friends and colleagues, Sigal Ben-Prath, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, talked about the concept of inclusive freedom. And that's the way I relate very much to the structural issues that both Erwin and Ellis and Anthony and Susan talked about. Yes, freedom of speech is essential if we are to have a meaningful democracy, but a meaningful democracy is really essential if we are going to have freedom of speech that is not just Congress shall make no law, as the First Amendment says, but is a meaningful exercise and enjoyment of participation in the democratic discourse by every member of our society. And that means taking many other affirmative steps, including educational steps, access to technology, even psychological resources and resilience to deal effectively with speech that is deeply traumatizing and problematic. So when people ask me what is the state of free speech today and why am I spending so much time on it, it is not at all because I think that it is the only embattled liberty or right. To the contrary, we've seen a whole laundry list here. And it's certainly not at all because I think it is the most important. I think one can make a case in terms of the interrelatedness of all of these rights. In Susan's book, it quotes some famous Supreme Court statements about voting being the prerequisite for the exercise of all other liberties. I could say equality is the prerequisite, because what is freedom if it's not equally available to everybody in this country? But I think the reason why I decided to focus on freedom of speech is because I think it is not nearly as, or had not been nearly as well understood or appreciated, especially by the younger generation of outspoken activists, as indicated by regular public opinion polls. And again, I'm the optimist. I always see the glass half full. And I think that part of the reason for not understanding what I believe to be the crucial importance of free speech for the struggles to which they are committed is that they've had the luxury of taking it for granted. And exactly as Anthony says, when they start to see that suppression on various rationales, including that the speech makes somebody uncomfortable or divisive. I mean, the Republicans and the conservatives have taken that exact language to outlaw or jeopardize the teaching of race and gender issues. And so this also relates to Susan's opening anecdote, which I know I'd heard you tell before, but I had forgotten that, Susan, about being denied equal access. I mean, there you have it, equal access to the right to read, equality and free speech rights in one swell foop. That was your formative moment in becoming a civil libertarian. I had exactly a parallel experience. I was kept out of my public library because of age. I mean, basically, I was relegated to 2 rooms for people under the age of 18, which I had read many times over long before the age of 18. So, the silver lining to the cloud of the very visible attacks, including on the right to read, is we are seeing amazing activism. I hope you've all seen some of the examples of even middle school kids forming banned book clubs, testifying not only before school boards about how important these books are. There was one situation that I read about a local school board in a very conservative rural area in Pennsylvania a year or 2 ago where the usual books were banned. You know that most of the books that have been banned lately are either by or about LGBTQ plus authors or racial minorities. And it was a very deeply read area, or ED, and at the school board hearing, a trans student stood up, and I saw a video of their testimony, which was, the narrative, right, Anthony? It was so powerful, literally talking about how these books had saved their life. That this was somebody who was on the verge of suicide and had nobody in that community who was a role model or a confidant. And the book was there as a lifeline. And it turned around that school board. And you see these kids also testifying before their state legislatures and becoming plaintiffs and winning ACLU lawsuits, including at the United States Supreme Court. So there's a great deal of cause for hope. In terms of freedom of speech, I would say, beyond, I've already said why the First Amendment is necessary but not sufficient in terms of really making the right meaningful. But let me just add a couple other reasons for that conclusion. One is that we are seeing such, I think, unprecedented aggregation of private sector power to exercise sensorial control that until now had only been exercised by governments. And I heard recently, I know we've got some experts here, Jamil Jaffer among others, Johnny Askin, but I was speaking at the University of Chicago, and one of the experts there said something that I had not been aware of, that the concentration that we're seeing at the social media level, the level at which content is disseminated or not disseminated at the behest of the platform. This person said that that degree of concentration is now going all the way down to the pipeline to the deepest service infrastructure elements of the internet. I'm looking at Johnny. I don't know whether that's true or not. See, I've gotten to be very skeptical about everything I hear, right? A healthy skepticism in the age of disinformation. The other claim that was made was that these infrastructure providers, which used to, since they're so removed from the content level, used to not engage in content moderation, i.e., what I would call censorship, deciding that some voices and speakers can be heard but not others. And the allegation was that that is now happening even at these deepest levels, which raises very serious questions, especially for those of us who believe that private sector entities should have their own free speech rights. So I find these to be very, very difficult questions. I'm glad that such brilliant minds as Jamil and his colleagues at the Knight Institute and Johnny and his colleagues here are working on these questions. But they certainly, as a practical matter, are really going to make an enormous difference. And the other, I think, elephant in the room, I'll just toss it out, is cancel culture, which is, again, a very, very difficult issue because what we're talking about are people exercising their own free speech rights, but in ways that are perhaps having an unduly speech suppressive impact on others. And speaking of which, Susan, I'm so sorry I didn't see you. I'm just going to say one other thing, which is out of great respect for Brooklyn Law School and my friend and colleague Susan, I wore your lovely school colors, which Susan, thank you for having such nice colors.
We appreciate it. Thank you. So you can see why these are the people who I wanted to have talk about the many, many issues there are to discuss. Unfortunately, there was already a lot of Q&A involved in what they were saying because I had asked them a bunch of questions. So I think we have time for maybe one chosen question before we have to break and move to the reception, et cetera. And if somebody online wants to ask that, you can type in your question. And other than a question, David Cole, you've been mentioned a few times. If you want to speak for yourself, you're welcome to. Okay, you're happy with what was said. Okay, do we have one question? Sarah, okay. Sarah, you just want to read out the question? I don't have my...
The question is, how can civil rights and liberties and American democracy more broadly survive racial resentment?
How can civil liberties imagine?
How can civil rights and liberties and American democracy more broadly survive racial resentment?
Okay, could everybody hear the question? Do we have a microphone? Oh, here, okay. Here, Sarah. So people up here could hear it, so they're thinking about their answers while we're just communicating the question to everybody else. And then we'll have a quick answer, and then I will just make a wrap-up remark.
Can you hear me?
This is Sarah Corsico, one of our wonderful students who agreed to monitor the entire webinar.
I'm not sure. Oh, there we go. Okay. How can civil rights and liberties and American democracy more broadly survive racial resentment?
Okay, so who wants to take that? That's a short answer, right, Ellis?
Sure, I'll begin it. I mean, I think there are some parts of there are some things that are going to go by the wayside, and we're already seeing the beginning of that going by the wayside with affirmative action. But you can't you can't just because you have racial resentment erase 40 years of civil rights law. There are certain and certain values like equal opportunity are going to continue to be a value. We're never going to go back to a society that's segregated by race. That's just not going to happen. That's not something that we can do. But I do think that, as we saw with Reconstruction, after post-Reconstruction, there is an attempt to reverse Reconstruction. Am I gone?
Yeah, you're on.
Okay. And I think that we're now seeing a similar thing happening, where Reconstruction, of course, came about when you had a majority of the South, a majority of whites in the South, who still fervently believed that black folks didn't deserve any rights. You're not going to have that now. There are too many people who believe differently. There are too many people who believe in a multiracial democracy. And that's why I said earlier that I think we're going to have a generation, battle going on here between those forces who want to sort of return things to the past and those who don't. And there are going to be some battles that are won and some that aren't. And I think the things that are easy to pick apart, things that try to correct past discrimination by having current discrimination, are going to have a harder time surviving. Those things that approach equality from a different perspective are going to have an easier time surviving. But in the end, it's going to be a question of what happens, as I've said before, to the next generation and how they end up dealing with these issues.
I have
Sure,
to
Irwin, please.
I apologize. I'm going to speak and then immediately leave because I have an Uber downstairs at 6:40 to take me to the airport. So let me.
We want to get him home to his family. That's important.
Thank you again for having me. I think our democracy is more in danger than it's been at any time in American history. I recently heard a United States Senator, Peter Welch, say, whether our democracy can survive is a jump ball. Imagine if Donald Trump were to be elected in 2024 and the Republicans would take both houses of Congress. Do we believe democracy would survive? I think that if that were to happen, we'd see the first serious secession movement since the Civil War. And I think that Ellis pointed to many of the things that threaten our democracy. The Electoral College that increasingly makes it likely that the candidate who loses the popular vote will be president. The United States Senate, how it's constituted in the filibuster. Partisan gerrymandering for the House, the Supreme Court gutting voting rights, the Supreme Court empowering corporations through Citizens United, the continuing racial inequalities that are mentioned. And I think the question is, how can our country overcome these and how can democracy survive? And take it back to the Supreme Court, what will it mean at a time when our country is so politically polarized to have a Supreme Court that's come down on the far right side of that divide? So, I think we all have to think through this question of how can we fight to save democracy, but I think we should all be very worried at this moment in time.
Thank you, Irwin. Anthony, I'll give you a moment to speak, but let's let Irwin make his graceful exit. You're welcome, Dave. It's just he has to run. Okay,
Bye,
Anthony.
Irwin. Thank you for coming. It was lovely to see you.
Safe home. See you in California.
I guess I want to pick up on the word resentment, because that's the one that I was kind of stuck in my head as I was hearing this sentence. And I guess there's a part of me that thinks I am comfortable with the conflict that comes with the fight for equality. And there are going to be resentments. So be it. I think if we're on a path for giving people greater opportunities and greater pathways for agency and self-actualization, I think the resentments are worth the price as we get through it. I remember the whole debate around affirmative action. I was definitely an affirmative action baby when I went to college. I was the first one in my family to finish high school. Did not have the SAT scores of my roommates. Princeton very much picked me because I checked the Puerto Rican box. I was insecure about the being an affirmative action baby at Princeton at that time. I am really glad I dealt with that insecurity, and so be it, the resentment that I took someone else's seat, because it gave me an opportunity to prove myself. I sat for my own exams. I earned my own grades. My grades were all blind on the blue book. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know that I was the first generation in my family to be taking those exams. And so I earned my place. And so the resentments that come into giving people like me an opportunity to compete, to succeed, I think are worth the kind of the transaction costs initially, because ultimately you make change by being there.
For a second, Anthony.
Go ahead.
Because a lot of the resentment that we see now is not because somebody got affirmative action. It's this very sense that this whole replacement theory nonsense. There's this sense that the country is changing in ways they don't like, and maybe too many black people are voting. Maybe too many immigrants are voting. That's a little bit different than the resentment that you're talking about. And I'm just wondering how you process that kind of resentment and its consequences.
I think there are some who are definitely going to feel that sense of being besieged or being replaced. I also think that part of what happens is that people grow and change, and they get to be wrong and then get to be in the right. There was massive resentment when we moved out of the projects into this working class white community in Passaic County, New Jersey, and my parents had to bribe the superintendent to move in. There was major resentment that we were Puerto Ricans moving into that neighborhood. And, we were called all sorts of words, and my sister stopped speaking Spanish at that time, and my dark-skinned cousins who were across the street got even worse of the hurt and the hate. And yet, over time, as we lived alongside of some very kind of racist, white, ethnic, Italian, Irish, other folk, we became part of the community, and we changed their points of view. And, rubbing up against each other, they got to know what it was like to be Puerto Rican. The Irish family that didn't want us moving in next door, the young Irish girl of that family now speaks very good Spanish because she learned it from my mother and my father. And so I believe that part of what happens is that you work through these resentments. Look at the way that gay people are now accepted. I mean, it's just like I've seen that in my lifetime. I'm 58 years old. I think part of what we change hearts and minds by forcing the proximity. When Brian Stevenson talks about being proximate, people are not going to get close. Sometimes you have to force the closeness so they get the perspective and the knowledge. And so, I don't know, Ellis. I mean, that's where I think that in some ways we'll see them on the other side, and I think we'll bring a lot of them along with us. And maybe that's overly optimistic, but I'm flexing that muscle for you right now.
Okay, I can tell you,
last comment, Nadine.
sorry,
Then we're gonna
it's
have to-
backed up by a famous sociological study that's been confirmed by many, many hundreds of subsequent studies called the contact theory, which was formulated by Gordon Allport, a social psychologist at Harvard, right after the Holocaust, when he was looking into how can we prevent what caused the genocide, the support for it, how can we prevent it. And it's such common sense, but I love it when these sophisticated social science studies, prove that common sense really works. And that is the way you get over your resentment, your prejudice, your stereotyping, your demonization of the other, is to make them not the other, to have actual contact with people and to appreciate them with all of the complexity that all of us individuals have. What's even more encouraging and relevant in an era where, unfortunately, we are physically and geographically so living in such segregated communities in various ways, is there have been hundreds and hundreds of studies that have shown that social contact is virtually as effective, virtually being a pun, meaning that if you see the images of the other on TV shows or in books or in movies, that has virtually the same impact as actually interacting in person, which is another reason for wanting to make our literature and our cultural depictions more inclusive.
So there's the optimistic thread for tonight, that we can change, and a lot of the way that we change is person to person. But one of the most striking comments to me tonight was Ellis's claim that we're actually not going to get anywhere unless we can change the Constitution. I recently read a description of the Constitution as an 18th century legal corset. So here we are with this corset, right? The problem of the Electoral College that we can't get rid of, and we can't actually change the Constitution because of the difficulty of the amendment process. And you look at the red and blue states, and it's not going to happen. So, I think that leaves us in kind of a difficult place that we can talk about more during the reception, because there's still a great deal to talk about. So let me just make a few concluding remarks. First, anybody who wants to see this again, or if you know people who weren't here and you tell them that you really should have seen it, it will be available on the Law School's YouTube channel. It will also be posted on the website of the Network for Responsible Public Policy, and maybe some other places too. TikTok, anyone? I also want to mention that the Brooklyn Journal of Law and Policy is planning to publish a piece on tonight's discussion. So John Cusker, who is right there, who had this idea, if you want to introduce yourself to the panelists, they absolutely promise that they will not publish anything, transcript or summary, without everybody having seen it and consented. So that'll be another place where you can hear more. So if you want one of these magnificent books that was certainly worthy of a book event, you can buy one on the table right outside. But ACLU people, board and staff members who are here, you don't need to buy a book, because Andrew has taken care of that for you, as he takes care of everything else for you. And what I have done is, in advance, is I have personalized a copy of the book for each and every one of you. So you can pick that up from Andrew on the 10th floor at the reception. So books to buy are on the 7th floor. Books to pick up, because of Andrew, are upstairs. The reception will be on the 10th and 11th floors. Both floors we have a kind of overflow room. Because of the ACLU's co-sponsorship here, we are having a full bar, right? Mixed drinks, not just the usual wine and beer. So how's that for generosity? There will also be tables with chairs on the 11th floor, so anybody who doesn't want to mill around and do the cocktail party thing, you can actually go upstairs. And there are two different ways to get there. So to the 10th floor, you can take one of the 4 elevators right out here and go to 9, and then you could walk up a flight if that's something you care to do. Or you can go to the side and wait for the one and only elevator that goes to both 10 and 11. So I leave you with that choice. So the final thing that I want to say is, as somebody was saying before, nothing happens without all the people behind the scenes. So I've already thanked Jocelyn and Andrew for, kind of being the architects of this event. But I also want to thank our event staff, especially Liz Alper and everybody else, and the AV people and everyone else who just makes events happen and make them work. So standing ovation for Liz Alper, if you're still here. Thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you at the reception. How are you feeling, Susan?
I really enjoyed it. It was
Great, wasn't
fascinating.
it? I thought it was wonderful discussion.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone.
They were all just great. Oh, thank you. I was